I got this $7,200 slab of old growth redwood from a tree that was over 1,000 years old, and that is pretty incredible. But some of you might be upset that I'm going to be using a 1,000-year-old tree just to build a table, and I have good news. This is actually not going to be a table. And also, more good news, I'm going to be covering it with plastic, so at least small parts of this table will last like 1,000,000 years. For those of you still watching that haven't unliked and unsubscribed, I'm only partially kidding. Didn't cut down a living tree just to build a piece of furniture out of it, and my wood supplier didn't either. What most of these big old growth slabs come from is what was left behind from the loggers, 100 years ago when they were cutting these big old growth redwoods down. Because the bottom of the tree with all this crazy compressed grain, that was terrible for building material. You don't want a 2x4 with all this figured wood, so they just left these stumps behind. And now companies like GL Veneer, the company where I got this one, are coming back and salvaging them and enabling people like me to try to make something cool out of it. Besides the cost, there is a lot of reasons not to like working with redwood. It is incredibly soft, which means you have to be very careful through all the steps. And here's how I'm kind of leaning into some of that soft wood aspect, is just using that angle grinder to eat away all the very soft and medium soft wood and leaving something that's still fairly firm, but still pretty soft in the end. But this is what I'm going to do to firm it up. This is just a regular clear marine epoxy, and I'm just letting as much of it absorb into the wood as possible, and this will really firm it up for the next step of the process. Now, I said at the start of the video that this was not going to be a table, but I don't actually know that yet as I'm filming it here, because I thought I was building an epoxy table, and I'll explain a little bit more on that later. But what I really wanted to do, this was just kind of an experimental project of mine. I'd wanted to combine redwood with this just barely frosted epoxy, and you'll see what it looks like here in just a second. I added just a little bit of blue to offset any potential yellowing of that epoxy down the line. And what I want is just kind of a foggy, smoky effect that lets you see through the epoxy, but not crystal clear. This was a pretty sketchy pour. There was about 15 gallons of epoxy. It was about 2.5 inches thick, and this is thicker than I ever recommend pouring except under extreme circumstances. And if you want to know more about those extreme circumstances and why you don't want to pour so much at once, I'll just tell you, it will cause it to overheat and crack. But I do have an epoxy table workshop on my website if you want more information on how to build an epoxy table in your home shop or garage and avoid all of these pitfalls and know things like why you don't want to pour too much epoxy, and also what do you do if you need to pour that much epoxy, because like I said with this one, I had that frosted epoxy that I really couldn't do in several layers. It had to be in one big pour. Anyway, more information on my website, blacktailstudio.com, if you want to check out that epoxy workshop. Maybe someday I'll be lucky enough to have a CNC and hopefully also